In 2011, two archaeologists went into the mountains of southeastern Uzbekistan looking for the Bronze Age. That was the project. Michael Fricchetti from Washington University in St. Louis and Farhad Maksudov, who now directs Uzbekistan's National Center of Archaeology, were working on questions about early pastoralists, the herding societies of Central Asia 4,000 years ago. They were following the kind of lead that fills most field seasons: a promising valley, some surface material, a reason to go and look. They climbed to a high plateau called Tugunbulak at roughly 2,000 meters, and the ground was wrong. Scattered across the surface was pottery, not Bronze Age pottery, medieval pottery, the wrong period by about 3,000 years. Along with it, the physical residue of a settlement that had no business being there. This was high, cold, remote ground, the kind of place where the growing season is short and the winters are serious, and where the standard model of Central Asian history said you would find seasonal camps, not towns. They had been looking for herders. They had walked onto a city. Then a local told them about a bigger site 3 kilometers away. What happened over the following 13 years, culminating in a paper published in Nature in October of 2024, did not just add 2 dots to the archaeological map of Central Asia. It challenged an assumption that had shaped how the entire region was understood, that the high mountains were a corridor people passed through, not a place where urban civilization happened. Because Tugunbulak, the second site, turned out to be roughly 10 times the size of the first, around 120 hectares of occupied ground, at over 2,000 meters of altitude, close to twice the footprint of Pompeii, a city in the sky, on a mountain no one had thought to scan, that thrived between the 8th and 11th centuries and then went quiet. The question this video is about is not where it was. We know that now. The question is why anyone would build it there at all. And the answer turns out to be sitting in the rock underneath. To understand why this find mattered enough for nature, you have to understand what the map looked like before it. The Silk Road, as it is usually drawn, is a set of lines connecting cities: Xi'an, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Baghdad. These are lowland places, river valleys, oases, plains, and they are where the famous archaeology is, where the caravans arise and the mosques and the markets are. Between them, on most maps, are mountains. And the mountains are drawn as terrain to be crossed, passes with names, routes that thread between the peaks, places of danger and delay, where you hired guides and hoped the weather held. That framing was not arbitrary. It reflected a genuine assumption in the field, that high-altitude environments could not support dense, permanent urban populations. The reasoning is straightforward. Above 2,000 meters, the growing season shortens dramatically. Cereal agriculture becomes marginal or impossible. Winters are long and hard. Transport is difficult and expensive. Every calorie is harder to produce and harder to move. Cities need surplus. Surplus needs agriculture. Agriculture needs a growing season. Mountains do not have one. So the model said, highlands are for pastoralists, mobile herders, moving flocks between summer and winter pasture, living in a way that leaves relatively little permanent architecture behind. Not peripheral exactly. Pastoralists were essential to the whole system, supplying animals, transport, and military capacity. But not urban. Globally, this assumption has some support. Even today, only a small fraction of humanity lives at high altitude. Highland urbanism is genuinely rare, but rare is not the same as absent. And an assumption that is broadly reasonable can still be locally, spectacularly wrong. The problem was that nobody had properly looked. Here is a thing that is easy to miss about archaeology. The difficulty is rarely that sites are buried deep. Often they are right there, and you still cannot see them. Tugunbulak and Tugunbulak sit under grass. Not jungle, not sand dunes, not meters of accumulated sediment. Alpine meadow. Walk across Tugunbulak, and you are walking over gentle rises and dips in the turf. The sort of undulation you would attribute to erosion or old landslips without a second thought. Local herders had grazed animals there for generations. Nobody was hiding anything. The structures underneath are largely earthen. In this region, monumental building did not necessarily mean cut stone. It meant rammed earth and mud brick, materials that are strong, insulating, locally available, and, crucially, that decay into something that looks almost exactly like the hillside around them. Standing in the middle of a site like this, you see maybe a few meters of ground in useful detail. You can trace an alignment if you are lucky. You can dig a trench and learn a great deal about a very small area. What you cannot do is see the shape of the whole thing, and the shape is the point. A settlement's plan, where the walls run, how the buildings cluster, whether there is a citadel, whether it was designed or grew organically, tells you what kind of place it was. Without that, you have artifacts without a city. Early estimates of Tugunbulak's size, based on what could be surveyed conventionally, put it at a fraction of its actual extent. The LiDAR scan revised that upward by a factor of 6. The technique that changed this deserves explaining because it is genuinely elegant and it has quietly transformed archaeology over the past 2 decades. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. The principle: fire a laser pulse at the ground, measure precisely how long it takes to bounce back, and you know the distance. Do that hundreds of thousands of times per second from a moving platform with accurate positioning, and you can build a 3-dimensional model of a landscape at centimeter scale resolution. The trick that makes it archaeologically powerful is what happens with vegetation. A laser pulse fired at grass or forest does not all hit the same thing. Some of it reflects off leaves and stems. Some slips through the gaps and reaches the actual ground below. The sensor records multiple returns from a single pulse, and software can then separate them, discarding the vegetation and keeping only the last return, the one that touched soil. The result is what is sometimes called a bare earth model, a picture of the terrain as if every plant had been removed. Grass, scrub, and forest canopy stripped away, leaving the ground surface exposed in exact relief. On that model, things become obvious that are invisible in person. A wall reduced to a low ridge over 1,000 years reads clearly as a straight line. A collapsed tower is a circular mound. Terraces, ditches, roads, building platforms, all of it emerges as geometry. And geometry is the signature of human intention. Nature makes patterns, but it rarely makes right angles at scale. The team flew their scans on drones rather than aircraft, which matters at altitude and in mountains. Low, slow, close flight lines produce far denser data, and drones can follow steep terrain in a way that a fixed-wing survey plane cannot. If this sounds like a niche technical improvement, consider what it has already done elsewhere. At Angkor in Cambodia, the temples had been known and studied for over a century. What LiDAR revealed was that the famous monuments were the surviving stone fragments of something far larger, an enormous low-density urban landscape with roads, canals, water management systems, and residential areas spread across the surrounding forest. The temples were never the city. They were the parts of the city built from material that does not rot. In the Maya lowlands of Guatemala, scans over dense rainforest returned tens of thousands of previously unrecorded structures: house platforms, causeways, agricultural terracing, defensive works. The revision was not incremental. It changed estimates of population and social complexity substantially, and it did so in a region that generations of archaeologists had walked through on foot. The pattern in both cases is the same. Sites that were considered well understood turned out to be well understood only where someone had physically stood. Everything under the canopy or under the grass was a guess. What LiDAR does is remove the guess. And what it keeps revealing is that ancient people built more, over larger areas than we credited them with. Not because the evidence was hidden, but because we had no way to see it at the right scale. Tugunbulak is the same story, in a different landscape. The obstacle was not rainforest, it was turf. What came back was not a hint, it was a plan. Tugunbulak, the first site, covers roughly 12 hectares. By the standards of Central Asian cities, that is modest. A town, not a metropolis. It was, in its own right, already surprising at this altitude. Tugunbulak is about 10 times larger, something on the order of 120 hectares of occupied ground. Numbers at that scale stop meaning much, so anchor it. That is close to twice the walled area of Pompeii. If you have seen photographs of Pompeii and formed a sense of how long it takes to walk across a Roman city, imagine walking twice that, at 2,000 meters of altitude, in a place that on every existing map was blank. And what the scan revealed was not a sprawl of huts. It was structured. The models show fortification, watchtowers, and internal divisions. The architecture of a place organized for defense and control, not a settlement that simply accreted. There are large structures that read as monumental. There is layout. The arrangement of space according to a plan, which implies authority, and implies that someone had both the power to impose a design and a reason to. Two cities, 3 kilometers apart, at the same altitude, occupied over the same broad period, the 8th through 11th centuries. Radiocarbon dating of the oldest excavated burial at Tugunbulak returned a date of around 720 of the Common Era. This was not a frontier outpost or a seasonal market that got out of hand. This was a highland urban landscape with more than one center that persisted for something like 300 years. Which brings us back to the question the model said should not have an answer. How do you feed a city where wheat will barely grow? You do not. You feed it by producing something so valuable that food comes to you. The mountains around Tugunbulak have two things in unusual combination, and together they explain the entire site. The first is iron ore. This region is geologically rich in it, the raw material of medieval technology, the substance from which tools, weapons, horseshoes, nails, plowshares, and armor were made. In the 8th to 11th centuries across Eurasia, demand for iron was effectively unlimited. It is worth being concrete about why, because iron was important, is the kind of statement that slides past without landing. Iron is what lets you farm at scale. An iron-shod plow breaks heavy soil that a wooden one cannot, which means more land under cultivation, which means more food, which means more people. Iron is what lets you build. Nails, brackets, tools for shaping timber and stone. Iron is what lets you fight. Swords, spearheads, arrowheads, mail, and the fittings of every piece of military equipment. And iron is consumable. Blades dull and break. Plowshares wear down against rock. Horseshoes need replacing constantly. And in a region built on cavalry, that alone is a permanent demand. Unlike gold, which accumulates, iron is used up. A society does not buy iron once. It buys iron continuously, forever. Which means a settlement that could reliably produce good iron in quantity was not selling a luxury. It was selling the thing everything else was made of. The second ingredient is what made that possible. It is juniper forest, dense stands of it, growing on those same slopes. That second one sounds less impressive than the first, and it is at least as important. You cannot smelt iron with ore alone. You need fuel, and not just any fuel. You need charcoal, which burns hot enough and clean enough to reduce ore to metal, and charcoal requires wood in enormous quantity. Historical iron production consumed forests. It is one of the reasons medieval and early modern ironworking regions are so often also regions of deforestation. Ore in the ground and forest on the slopes in the same place is a rare and powerful combination. It is the medieval equivalent of finding oil next to a refinery. So, the logic inverts completely. Tugunbulak was not a city that survived despite being in the mountains. It was a city that existed because of them. The altitude that made farming marginal was the same altitude that put the ore and the timber within reach. Grain could be brought up, iron went down. And once you see the settlement as an industrial center rather than an agricultural one, everything else fits. The fortifications, the scale, the organization, the persistence over centuries. This was not a village that got lucky. It was infrastructure. There is another thread here, and it comes not from the ground, but from a library. Medieval Arabic and Persian geographers wrote extensively about Central Asia. They were not casual travel writers. Working within a scholarly tradition that valued precision, they compiled descriptions of provinces, routes, distances, products, and towns. Reference works for administrators, merchants, and the curious. This tradition deserves more respect than it usually gets in popular history, where medieval knowledge tends to be treated as a gap between the Greeks and the Renaissance. It was nothing of the sort. Scholars working in Arabic and Persian between roughly the 9th and 14th centuries produced systematic geography at a level of detail that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Road networks with distances, descriptions of local products and industries, notes on populations, languages, and customs, and in some cases, maps. They did this because there was demand for it. An empire that stretched from Iberia to the edge of India needed administrators who knew what was where. Merchants operating across that span needed to know which routes were viable, what each region produced, and where to sell it. Geography was not an academic curiosity. It was working infrastructure. Among these scholars was Ibn Hawqal, writing in the 10th century, whose geographical survey covers the Islamic world in considerable detail. He traveled extensively, and his descriptions of Central Asian provinces are specific about what each place made and traded. The texts describe a place in these mountains known for iron, a production center significant enough to be named, whose metalworking drew people from distant places. The name that appears is Marsmanda. For a long time, it was one of many settlement names in the medieval sources that could not be tied to any known ruin. This happens constantly in historical geography. A text names a town, sometimes describes it, and the physical location is simply lost. The name floats free. Researchers have proposed that Tugunbulak is Marsmanda, and the case is reasonable, an iron-producing center of substantial size, in the right mountains, in the right period, matching the descriptions. I want to be careful about how firmly to state that. Identifying an archaeological site with a name from a medieval text is one of the more difficult things in the field, and it is rarely conclusive unless something is found bearing the name itself. The proposal is plausible and the correspondences are good. It is not the same as proof, but if it holds, something rather satisfying follows. This city was never truly lost. It was in the written record the entire time, described by a geographer 1,000 years ago, waiting for someone to work out which grassy plateau he had meant. This discovery lands hardest on a distinction that has organized how people write about Central Asia for a very long time: nomads versus settled societies. The traditional framing goes something like this. There were the settled peoples of the oasis cities, farmers, merchants, artisans, builders of walls and mosques. And there were the nomads of the steppe and the mountains, mobile, pastoral, militarily formidable, culturally distinct. The two interacted through trade, tribute, and periodic conquest, but they were fundamentally different modes of life. Tugunbulak does not fit on either side of that line. The region was, in this period, under the control of Turkic dynasties whose power base was pastoral. These were societies built around herding, mobility, and cavalry. And yet here is a fortified, planned industrial city of 120 hectares in their highland territory, operating for 3 centuries. The obvious reading is that the categories were never as separate as the framing suggests. The same political systems that moved herds could also build and run cities, and did, when there was a reason to. Mobility and urbanism were not opposed ways of life belonging to different peoples. They were options available to the same societies, deployed where each made sense. A herding economy that also controls iron production and a fortified manufacturing center is not a contradiction. It is a diversified one. That reframing matters beyond this valley because the nomad versus settled binary has done a lot of quiet work in how the history of this region gets told, usually to the disadvantage of the mobile societies, who tend to appear in the narrative as forces of nature that periodically arrive, destroy, and recede. The people who built Tugunbulak were not a force of nature. They were running an industrial operation at 2,000 meters. It is worth pausing on the phrase itself, because this find exposes a bias built into it. Silk Road was coined in the 19th century by a German geographer. Nobody who used these routes ever called them that. And the term carries 2 distortions. The first is the singular. There was no road. There was a shifting web of routes, and which ones were active depended on politics, water, security, and season. The second is subtler and more consequential. The phrase makes the whole thing sound like a connection between endpoints. China at one end, the Mediterranean at the other, and everything between reduced to transit space. Under that framing, Central Asia is a corridor, valuable because of what passes through it, not for what it produces. That framing has always been wrong, and Highland Tugunbulak makes the error concrete. This was not a place goods passed through. It was a place goods came from. The iron produced in these mountains was a commodity in its own right, moving out into the same networks that carried silk and spices and horses. The city existed because of what was under its feet, not because of what was traveling past. And it suggests something about the mountains generally. If two cities of this scale sat unrecorded on a plateau in southeastern Uzbekistan for 1,000 years, the reasonable inference is not that they were a unique anomaly. It is that Highland Central Asia has been systematically undersurveyed because the model said there would be nothing there, and so nobody flew a scanner over it. You find what you look for. The corollary is that you do not find what you have decided is not there. I want to spend a moment on what daily life in this place would have actually involved, because the scale numbers can make it abstract. At 2,000 to 2,200 meters, in the mountains of Central Asia, winter is not a mild inconvenience. Snow closes roots. Temperatures drop well below freezing for extended periods. The frost-free window for growing anything is short, a matter of months, not most of the year. Everything that a lowland city takes for granted becomes a logistical problem. Grain has to come up, which means it has to be carried, which means someone is organizing and paying for pack animals across mountain tracks. Enough of it has to arrive before the passes close, and it has to be stored somewhere dry for the months when nothing arrives at all. Fuel is the same problem in reverse. Juniper on the slopes solves smelting, but it also has to heat homes through those winters, and a forest that is feeding furnaces is a forest under pressure from two directions at once. Then there is the work itself. Smelting iron in the medieval period is hot, dangerous, skilled labor. It requires furnace builders, charcoal burners, ore miners, smiths, and people to feed and house all of them. That is a workforce, and workforces require organization, which requires authority, which is presumably part of what the fortifications and internal divisions in the LiDAR model represent. None of this happens by accident, and none of it happens cheaply. Somebody decided that the iron was worth all of it, sustained that decision across generations, and built the institutions to make it work. For 300 years, they were right. Occupation at these sites runs, broadly, from the 8th century into the 11th. After that, the record thins. I want to be direct about the state of knowledge here, because this is exactly the point where documentaries usually reach for a dramatic ending and assert one. We do not have an established cause for the decline. The obvious candidate for anyone who knows the region's history is the Mongol conquest. But the chronology does not support it. The Mongols swept through Central Asia in the 1210s and 1220s, and these cities were already fading a century or more before that. Whatever ended Tugunbulak, it was not Genghis Khan. The plausible alternatives are less cinematic and harder to prove. Iron production can exhaust its fuel supply, cut the juniper faster than it regrows, and eventually the furnaces stop, regardless of how much ore is left. Trade routes shift, and a city that exists to supply a network can be stranded when the network moves. Political control changes, and an operation that depends on organized authority does not survive the loss of it. Climate fluctuates, and at the margins of viability, a small change in growing season or snowpack is not a small change at all. Any of these could have done it. Several of them together seems more likely than one clean cause. But the honest answer is that the research is ongoing. The excavation has covered a small fraction of a very large site, and nobody has published a settled explanation. A city ended. We do not yet know why. The gaps here are large and worth stating plainly. Population is unknown. Mapping a site's extent is not the same as counting who lived in it, and any figure you encounter is an estimate built on assumed densities. The identification with Marsmanda is proposed, not proven. The full extent of both sites is not established. LiDAR gives you the surface expression of what is there. It does not tell you how deep the occupation goes, or what lies outside the scanned area. The scale of iron production has not been quantified. That the mountains have ore and the settlement worked metal is established. How much iron actually left these valleys and where it ended up is a question that will need materials analysis, matching the chemical signature of objects found elsewhere to the ore source here. The relationship between the two cities is unclear. 3 kilometers apart, contemporaneous, but was Tugunbulak subordinate to Tugunbulak, a separate community, an earlier phase, a different function? Not resolved, and the largest gap is the one the find itself points at. If a scan of one plateau in one country produced 2 unrecorded cities, what would scans of the rest of Highland Central Asia produce? Nobody knows because it has not been done. I keep coming back to the moment in 2011 because I think it contains the whole thing. 2 archaeologists went looking for the Bronze Age. They were competent, well-prepared, and working from a reasonable research design. They walked onto a plateau at 2,000 meters, and what was under their feet was 3,000 years off from what they had come to find, and considerably more surprising. They did not miss it because they were careless. They found it despite a model that said not to bother looking. A model built on genuine reasoning about growing seasons and calories and transport costs, which was broadly true and locally, comprehensively wrong. That is worth sitting with, because it is not a story about one valley in Uzbekistan. Every map of the past has blank areas, and the blanks are not randomly distributed. They are wherever we decided nothing would be. Deserts, rainforests, seabeds, mountains. The places that were hard to survey, and the theory told us were empty, so the surveys never happened, and the absence of evidence became evidence of absence, and the blank on the map hardened into a fact about the world. For 1,000 years, a city the size of 2 Pompeii sat under alpine grass in southeastern Uzbekistan, 3 kilometers from another one, mentioned by name in a 10th century geography that scholars had been reading the whole time. It took a laser on a drone and 2 people looking for something else entirely. There is no reason to think it is the last one.